Now it's the U.S. versus China, and there's almost like Trump is saying countries have to make a decision. You choose between America or China. What can you tell us what's happening?
Yeah, well, he slapped these heavy tariffs on the whole world, and many of the countries, or the governments of these countries, approached him and asked for a reduction in the tariffs, offered to negotiate with them, but China was not one of those countries. China was the one country that quite openly said, "We're not accepting this, and if you're going to do this, we're going to retaliate and impose tariffs on you." So yeah, of course, Trump did, is he dropped the tariffs down to 10% in most cases for the rest of the world outside of China, with the exception of aluminum, steel, and automobiles. And there's a 25% tariff on those still. So still, substantial tariffs, really, even for the whole world, but much higher for China. Now China, it's up at 145%. There was some talk of 245%,
Right.
which is just silly. And then, I keep on hearing different things like, maybe 245% for certain categories, but not for everything. And then there was the talk that say, okay, well, we're going to actually reduce the tariffs on China in certain categories, namely laptops, consumer electronics, chips, back down to it would be 20% in the case of China rather than 145%. And as far as I know, that's what was done. But then I've also heard, reports that actually that wasn't done. I don't know. I don't know if anybody really knows what's going on right now. We were talking about laptops would double in price, and this is something that everybody would feel right away. So, maybe somebody who had Trump's ear pointed this out to him and said, this is going to be very, very unpopular. You're going to have to walk these ones, reduce those tariffs. So, yeah, this is a situation. But you're right to say that the focus is on China, and Trump is now, his administration is actually bargaining with all these other countries around the world to get them to kind of join the economic war against China. And I'm probably in some cases he's going to be successful, but I think this economic war against China is going to fail as much as the one that the U.S. launched against Russia. One thing is that, like I pointed out earlier, the U.S. just does not have that dominant position in the world economy that it once did. It's a very important economy, as it's a very important market, but its market is only 13% of the world market. And so, like, if you're a country looking at that, you say, well, of course I'd like to have the U.S. market, but it's not everything. We don't have that same kind of leverage that we once had, to force countries to comply. And China, of course, in the meantime, has become extremely important. And in a lot of different ways. It's not just that the cheap goods that they can provide, but also, they've invested heavily in a lot of countries around the world. They have a lot of economic muscle. So I think they're going to find that it's the Americans are going to find that it's just not so easy to twist arms the way that it once was. Again, they will succeed with certain countries. I think there's no question about it, but they're not going to be able to isolate China. And I think in doing this, the Chinese have shown a willingness to fight back and say, okay, you're going to play this game against us. We can play it against you. It's going to, it could be a really boomerang and hurt us if we go after China in that way. Again, China can fight back, and I think we're going to be finding that out very soon. We're going to feel the effects.
We have to know that, though, right? I mean, you just talked about Russia. Russia was sanctioned up the wazoo, right? And we've seen now over the past 3 or 4 years that it has actually performed better than the Western economies. It has been experiencing almost a bit of an economic revival. And I think Trump has to know that. He's been going through a bit of an educational process with Russia, with his Woodcock going over there and talking to him. He's got to understand. And you said, China, if Russia survived, China will be able to survive and fight back too. It's like, of course we can. And they're going to do so much more damage to us because prior to the sanctions on Russia, for example, when you go to the shelves of your grocery store or Walmart, you don't see made in Russia. Everything's made in China. So just, that China just has so much more weight to throw around in any type of economic battle. I mean, I think the most lay person can understand that. Everybody knows everything's made in China.
Right. Well, this is different. Like, I mean, we have the neocons who tend to both hate Russia and, to hate Iran and support Zionism and all that. We're talking about them. So they are a powerful force within the administration, and just within the deep state, the permanent bureaucracy. They've always been there, or not always been there, but they've been there for decades. It's different, proponents of tariffs. Let's say that's mainly something that just popped out of Trump's head. It's a personal obsession, and he doesn't really have the support within that permanent bureaucracy for that. There are some individual advisors that are standing on his side and supporting his moves there, but it's really, I think this is Trump versus the world. It's not really U.S. policy. I think just like everybody in the establishment is against this. There's hardly an economist that actually is in favor of what he's doing. There are economists who make rational arguments for tariffs of different kinds, but not the kind of tariff war that he's fighting. I think, they see this as all negative, that there's no benefit to this approach that he's taking. I mean, I think it really is, in his case, it's it arises out of ignorance. He just doesn't understand economics very well. I really don't think he does. A lot of politicians don't, but usually they just defer to, the economists. Sometimes, well, as we see in Europe, again, I don't think we have time to go into it, but it strikes me that they have very little understanding of economics too, and that's why they've cut themselves off from Russia, that they're depriving themselves of Russian gas, and they think that somehow that's going to be beneficial to them. And obviously can't. You have any sort of basic understanding of economics, you should have known that these sanctions were going to hurt you. I think they ended, but they didn't have the understanding of economics. And I think that's just equally true of Trump. Again, it's really not it's his own ignorance and his own obsession with tariffs that goes back decades that's driving this.
Right. With Europe, I think what we saw was maybe ideology trumping economic reasoning, that they weren't able to think rationally. But with Trump, I feel like maybe what's happening is he was originally, had this idea of bringing manufacturing back to the United States, and he had this idea to shake everything up with tariffs, but now it's backfiring, and really the only player that really matters is China. And China is flexing its muscle and showing that it's not going to bend the knee to the United States. And now it's kind of evolving, not so much about, let's bring manufacturing back and make America great again. I feel like it's turning into, it's the world, it's us versus China now. And the world needs to start to pick sides. Is that kind of what you're seeing this morphing into?
That's what this battle is degenerated into. It certainly seems to be true. I mean, part of it just seems like Trump just takes it as some sort of disrespectful of China. He was
right.
Remember, they all came in, as he put it in his crude language, to kiss my ass, right? But China wouldn't do that, and he's mad. I mean, this is ridiculous that it's come down to it, but it seems to be a lot of what's going on. It's just his own sense of his own importance, and his combined again with his ignorance of economics is, I think, created a huge mess.
So where do you see this going? Will we see kind of like countries step over onto the China side and to the America side? Will we start to get a tally of like what's going on?
Right.
But this whole thing, the idea that we will expect even our allies to come backing us up when we don't even have the same amount of economic incentive as China has to offer. Right. But we've pissed all them off too. We've tariffed off.
Right, exactly.
Right.
I mean, right. We've slapped some very high tariffs on close allies, right? And so that's if you're a country and you're thinking about long-term economic relations, do you really look at the U.S.? You say, like, what are these guys going to do next? The Chinese, I know what they're about. I have my differences with them, but they're systematic, they're consistent, and And I think in general, governments like companies like to work with predictable, consistent parties, and that's what China is, and the U.S. is not.